My name is Mara Ellison, and the night my fiancé's family tried to make me sign away the company I had built from the floorboards up, they did it beneath a chandelier that had been dimmed to hide the cracks in the ceiling. There were 54 guests at the rehearsal dinner, all dressed in the careful colors of people who believed good breeding could be recognized from across a room. My future mother-in-law stood at the head table in a silver dress, raised a champagne glass, and spoke about heritage, duty, and the responsibility of protecting a family name. Then she placed a cream-colored folder in front of me and said, with a smile polished enough for photographs, "Before tomorrow, we need one final assurance that you are not marrying Adrian for access to what belongs to us." She did not whisper. She wanted the room to hear. Her daughter watched me with open satisfaction. Her husband stared at the table. Adrian went rigid beside me, as if stillness could make the moment pass. And when his mother held out a fountain pen and added, "A woman entering this family with no background, no property, and no real standing should be grateful we are willing to protect her as well," every face in the room turned toward me. I picked up the pen. They thought humiliation had done its work. They thought a woman who arrived in an old pickup and wore department store dresses would choose marriage over dignity. They believed the folder resting against my knees contained nothing but a lipstick, my phone, and maybe a tissue for the tears they expected. They were wrong about what I owned, what I knew, and how long I had been preparing for the possibility that the man I loved would remain silent while his family tried to erase me. But to understand why I lifted that pen instead of walking out immediately, you have to understand how carefully I had trained myself to look ordinary. I owned Ellison Recovery Group, a commercial disaster restoration company that handled the aftermath of burst pipes, fires, storms, and structural failures. When a hospital corridor flooded at 3 a.m, my teams were the ones who arrived before the administrators had found their shoes. When a warehouse roof collapsed under ice, our crews stabilized the building, cataloged the damage, and worked around the clock so hundreds of employees could return. We dried schools, rebuilt hotels, cleared debris from municipal buildings, and restored homes after families had watched everything they owned turn black with smoke. I started the company at 23 with one dented cargo van, 2 industrial fans bought at auction, and a wet vacuum that shocked me whenever the cord bent the wrong way. By the time I met Adrian, I had 32 vehicles, 76 employees, regional contracts in 4 counties, and a company valuation that made bankers return my calls before the second ring. Almost nobody outside the business knew. Money had never made me feel safe. It had made other people curious. So I learned to edit myself. I stopped mentioning contracts. I stopped correcting people who assumed I rented my house. I let acquaintances believe the pickup was all I could afford. I told myself privacy was wisdom, and sometimes it was. But sometimes privacy was fear wearing a respectable coat. The oldest thing I owned was not a property, a vehicle, or a company share. It was a brass key on a thin leather cord. The key had belonged to my grandmother, Ruth Ellison, who raised me after my mother disappeared into addiction and my father disappeared into excuses. Ruth managed an apartment building for nearly 30 years. She fixed leaky faucets, replaced broken locks, scrubbed stairwells, collected rent, comforted widows, and knew which tenants needed an extra week without being asked. She kept a ring of keys clipped to her belt, and the largest brass one opened the basement workshop where she stored paint, tools, spare hinges, and every object she believed might one day be useful. Because broken is not the same as worthless, she said. A door does not care who your grandfather was, she told me. It opens for the person carrying the right key. Learn how things work. Learn how to repair what other people abandon. Then no one gets to decide whether you belong in the room. She died when I was 21. The apartment building was sold within a month. The new owners changed every lock and threw away most of the workshop. I kept the brass key, even though it opened nothing anymore. 2 years later, I started Ellison Recovery Group. I wore that key under my shirt when I signed my first school district contract. I held it during the hospital fire that nearly bankrupted us because the insurance payment was delayed for 5 months. I wrapped my fingers around it when I had to tell 30 employees that payroll would be late by 1 day, then sold my car so it would not be late at all. The key had no practical purpose. It did not open a building, a vault, or a safety deposit box. It opened the part of me that remembered who I had been before anyone measured me by what I lacked. I met Adrian Pembroke inside a public elementary school after a pipe burst above the music room. It was February, shortly before dawn, and water had soaked through the ceiling onto a row of instrument cases. My emergency crew was moving equipment while the fire department checked the electrical system. Adrian, who taught music there, arrived in mismatched gloves and a wool coat with a missing button. He did not stand in the doorway asking how long everything would take. He waded into the mess, picked up a stack of wet sheet music, and began carrying it to the dry end of the hall. I told him to stop, because the ceiling grid was unstable. He asked whether the cellos were safe. I said, the cellos are insured. He looked at me as if I had missed the point. They are also terrified second graders' cellos. That made me laugh, even though I had been awake for 20 hours. We spent the next 40 minutes moving instruments. When the last one was secured, he noticed the paperback sticking out of my coat pocket and asked if I liked the author. We argued about the ending while standing beneath a plastic containment sheet with water dripping into buckets around us. He was sincere without being naive, funny without making someone else the joke, and curious in a way that did not feel like an audit. He never asked what the company earned. For the first time, I mistook the absence of greed for the presence of courage. Adrian's surname was familiar long before his face was. The Pembrokes had been attached to the town for more than a century. There was a Pembroke reading room in the library, a Pembroke scholarship at the private academy, and a portrait of Adrian's great-grandfather in the courthouse corridor. People spoke of the family with that particular respect, reserved for names that had survived longer than the industries that created them. Adrian seemed embarrassed by the mythology. He taught at a public school, rented a modest apartment, and bought most of his clothes second-hand. He said his mother considered his profession a noble hobby. He told me he loved teaching because children were honest about what moved them. He also warned me more than once that his family could be difficult. What kind of difficult? I asked. He looked toward the window, the kind that calls controlled tradition. I should have listened more closely. The first time he took me to Pembroke House, I understood why people still believed the family was wealthy. The estate sat above the river behind iron gates, with stone pillars, clipped hedges, and windows tall enough to make visitors lower their voices. Inside, there were oil paintings, silver-framed photographs, and old furniture that looked too important to sit on. But restoration work had taught me to notice what appearances concealed. The roofline sagged slightly above the west wing. Hairline cracks ran from the corners of 2 windows. The heating system clicked too loudly. One section of hallway smelled faintly of damp plaster covered by expensive candles. The house was beautiful, but it was tired, and someone was spending more effort hiding that exhaustion than repairing it. Adrian's mother, Evelyn Pembroke, met me in the entrance hall wearing pearls and a navy dress. She kissed the air beside my cheek, then looked at my hands. "You work in cleaning after emergencies, is that right?" she asked. "Restoration," I said. "How useful." Her smile remained perfectly still. "People always need someone willing to deal with the unpleasant parts." At dinner, Adrian's younger sister, Camille, asked where I had gone to school. When I named the community college where I had taken night courses in accounting and construction management, she nodded as though I had confirmed something. "And your parents?" she asked. "My grandmother raised me." "How resilient," Evelyn said. She made the word sound like a condition found in poor neighborhoods. Adrian's father, Thomas, spoke very little. He had a broad, weathered face that did not match the softness of the room. Once, when Evelyn corrected the way I pronounced the name of a French wine, I caught him watching me with an expression I could not read. Not pity exactly. Recognition, perhaps. Then he looked down. I told myself the Pembrokes were formal. I told myself families with history had rituals outsiders did not understand. I told myself Adrian was worth the discomfort. What I did not tell myself was the truth. I wanted them. Not their money, not their name. I wanted the shape of a family that appeared permanent. My childhood holidays had been Ruth and me eating roast chicken at a folding table. There were no cousins running through the house, no inherited recipes, no stories everyone had heard too many times. After Ruth died, I worked through most holidays because an emergency call was easier than an empty kitchen. I wanted Adrian, but I also wanted the illusions surrounding him. I wanted to be invited every year without wondering whether the invitation would stop. I wanted a place setting that remained mine. That desire made me generous in all the wrong directions. When Adrian proposed 1 year later, he did it in the restored music room where we had met. The school custodian let us in after hours. Adrian had arranged candles on the empty risers and placed a small bouquet on the piano. His ring was a simple oval sapphire, not expensive, but chosen because Ruth had once worn a blue glass stone in an old photograph. I said yes before he finished speaking. For one evening, I believed love had opened the door. By the following afternoon, Evelyn had taken over the hinges. She announced that the wedding would be held at the Armitage Club because Pembrokes had celebrated marriages there since the 1920s. She sent me a guest list with more than 200 names, most of whom I had never heard. When I said I wanted to invite my crews and office staff, she replied, "Naturally, a few of your people should be included." My people. As though they were a delegation from another country. Every preference I expressed became a subject for review. I wanted seasonal flowers. Evelyn preferred imported white roses. I wanted a small ceremony. She said the family's position required visibility. I suggested a jazz trio. She had already booked a string quartet. When I said I would pay for the wedding myself, she stiffened. That would create an unfortunate impression. What impression? That our family could not provide. The sentence landed oddly. At the time, I thought it was pride. Later, I understood it was panic. Evelyn's disapproval rarely arrived in a form I could quote. It lived in pauses, corrections, and compliments sharpened at the edges. She praised my dress for being surprisingly appropriate. She asked whether my employees were reliable people. She told me I had a refreshing lack of pretension, then rearranged the seating chart so none of my guests were near the head table. She delivered each question casually, but I knew due diligence when I heard it. I answered truthfully, without answering fully. Camille heard what she wanted. Unstable work, borrowed equipment, no family capital, no pedigree. I watched relief settle over her face. That was the first moment I sensed the Pembrokes were not investigating me because they feared my wealth. They were gathering evidence of my poverty. Adrian saw the strain but treated it like weather. Whenever I described something his mother had said, he translated it into a less dangerous language. One night, after Evelyn moved my closest employee from the family table to a seat near the kitchen doors, I told Adrian I felt as though I were being admitted on probation. He rubbed both hands over his face. Please do not turn every choice into a fight. I did not choose the fight. I know. I just need you not to give her material. Material for what? He stared at me, exhausted. For whatever she decides to make difficult. He was not defending Evelyn. He was explaining how to survive her. That distinction mattered to him. It did not matter enough to me. I wanted him to say, "You will not treat Mara this way." Instead, he asked me to become harder to target. He had spent his entire life making himself smooth so his mother could not catch hold of him, and he mistook that skill for peace. I began to dread Pembroke House. Before each visit, I changed clothes twice. I removed my work watch because Evelyn once called it industrial. I checked words in my head before speaking. I laughed softly. I avoided mentioning the business. I became a guest in my own voice. The most dangerous losses do not always feel like loss while they are happening. Sometimes they feel like good manners. Sometimes they feel like compromise. Sometimes they feel like being mature for the sake of the person you love. I did not notice how much of myself I was leaving in the car until there was almost nothing left to bring inside. The first time I heard Evelyn call me an opportunist, I was standing in a corridor outside the drawing room with a tray of coffee cups in my hands. Dinner had ended. Adrian had gone upstairs to find an old record his father wanted to play, and I had offered to help carry things from the kitchen. As I approached the drawing room, Camille said my name. I stopped before entering, not because I intended to listen, but because Evelyn answered in a tone I had never heard her use around me. Adrian has always confused kindness with judgment, she said. Camille murmured something. Then Evelyn replied, "A woman like that does not attach herself to a Pembroke by accident. She sees a lonely son and what remains of a family position. Of course she is an opportunist." The coffee tray grew heavy in my hands. What caught me were the words, "what remains." entered the room before they could discover me listening. Evelyn smiled. Camille asked whether I needed help. I set down the tray without spilling a drop. For the rest of the evening, I watched the house differently. The silver tea service had been replaced by a plated set. 2 paintings were missing from the dining room, leaving cleaner rectangles on the wallpaper. The grand piano had a locked lid and a small auction house sticker beneath the bench. Thomas refused a second bottle of wine and said the cellar was being reorganized. The following week, Evelyn asked me to meet the club's event coordinator at Pembroke House. I arrived early and was shown in by a housekeeper who said Evelyn was on a call. While waiting, I went looking for the downstairs bathroom and opened a door at the end of a passage. It was Thomas's study. I realized my mistake immediately, but the room caught my attention before I could step back. 3 shelves were half empty. The carpet showed dark squares where cabinets had recently stood. On the wall above the desk were 4 pale outlines left by missing paintings. A shipping crate sat open near the window, lined with foam and stamped with the name of an auction firm in New York. On the desk lay a stack of envelopes. I did not touch them. I did not need to. The top one had a red final notice printed beneath the window. Another bore the logo of a private lender. A property tax statement had been opened and folded backward, exposing a number large enough to make even me pause. Beside the envelopes was a typed inventory of furniture, silver, paintings, and jewelry marked for appraisal. At the bottom of the page, someone had written in blue ink, "Insufficient to satisfy secured obligations." My fingers closed around the brass key beneath my blouse. Suddenly, every performance made sense. The Pembrokes were not protecting wealth from me. They were protecting the memory of wealth from everyone else. Their name was an expensive building with no working foundation. The estate, the club, the portraits, the inherited silver, everything visible existed to prevent anyone from asking what remained behind the walls. I backed out of the study and closed the door quietly. As I turned, I saw Evelyn at the far end of the passage. For one suspended second, neither of us moved. Her eyes went to the study door, then to my face. I expected fury. Instead, I saw fear so naked it changed her. She crossed the corridor quickly and said, "You are lost." "Yes. That room is private." "I understand." Her shoulders remained rigid. Some parts of a family are not for outsiders. The word outsiders should have hurt. Instead, I heard desperation beneath it. I could have told her what I had seen. I could have watched her invent explanations. I could have made her feel small in the hallway where she had spent months reducing me. I did none of those things. "I was looking for the bathroom," I said. She studied me for evidence of mockery. Finding none, she pointed toward another door. The event coordinator arrived 5 minutes later. Evelyn became gracious again, but one hand trembled when she lifted her coffee. That tremor stayed with me. Cruelty is easier to understand when it belongs to a monster. Evelyn was not a monster. She was a frightened woman who had converted fear into hierarchy because hierarchy gave her somewhere to place the shame. She had survived rejection by becoming its most devoted administrator. Understanding that did not excuse her. It only made the machinery visible. I kept what I had seen to myself. I did not tell Adrian about the notices. I did not tell anyone in town. I returned to my office and called Naomi Grant, the attorney who had represented Ellison Recovery Group since our first major contract. Naomi listened without interrupting while I described the engagement, the questions, the insults, and the study. Naomi continued, "Your company employs 76 people. You own the building, 2 warehouses, your home, and several investment accounts. You also have personal guarantees attached to business obligations. Marriage changes exposure. We need a fair agreement, separate counsel, full disclosure, and enough time for both of you to make informed decisions." We began drafting. My agreement was simple in principle. What each of us brought into the marriage would remain separate. Anything we built together would be shared. Neither spouse would inherit responsibility for undisclosed family debt. Both sides would provide complete financial statements, and both would have independent lawyers. It was not romantic. I placed the completed disclosure in a charcoal gray folder and locked it in my office safe. Then I went back to shrinking. That is the part people often misunderstand when they hear stories like mine. Knowledge does not immediately cure longing. Discovering the Pembrokes were drowning did not erase my desire to be accepted by them. If anything, it made me softer. I saw the cost of the estate through Evelyn's eyes. I imagined the humiliation of selling heirlooms one by one, while the town still expected gala donations and scholarship checks. I understood why she guarded appearances with the ferocity of a person guarding oxygen. I began making excuses for her before anyone asked. Every concession was small enough to survive. Together, they formed a life I could not breathe inside. 3 weeks before the wedding, Adrian came to my house carrying a cream-colored envelope. He set it on the kitchen counter, but did not sit. "My mother wants us to sign a family agreement," he said. "The prenup. A standard protection document." Standard for whom? He looked toward the envelope. "For the family." I opened it. The first page described the document as a premarital property and confidentiality agreement. The language was dense, but I understood contracts. By the 3rd page, my hands had gone cold. The agreement did not merely protect Pembroke assets. It classified nearly everything I owned, earned, developed, or acquired during the marriage as subject to management by a Pembroke family trust. It required me to waive claims against Adrian while granting the trust broad rights to any business interest that benefited directly or indirectly from the social position, introductions, reputation, or goodwill associated with the Pembroke name. The clause was absurd. My company had existed for 12 years before I met Adrian. Yet under their wording, a single dinner with a Pembroke acquaintance could become an argument that the family name had enhanced my business. Another section required confidentiality regarding private financial circumstances of the Pembroke family, with a penalty large enough to silence anyone who discovered the truth about the estate. The final section contained a waiver stating that I had been encouraged to seek independent counsel, although no one had encouraged me at all. They wanted my signature within 72 hours. I read the document twice. Then I looked at Adrian. "Did you read this?" "Most of it." "Read all of it." "Myra." "Read the section on business interests." He sat and read. I watched his eyes move over the page. At first, his expression showed confusion, then embarrassment, then the old familiar retreat. "This is probably boilerplate," he said. "It gives your family trust a claim on Ellison recovery. They do not know what Ellison recovery is worth. That makes it better." "No, I mean they are not trying to take it. They think they are protecting themselves by claiming something they believe has no value." He pressed his fingertips to his temples. "My mother is terrified that you will expose the family if the marriage fails." "Expose what?" His silence answered. "You know," I said. "I know things are complicated." "How complicated?" "The estate has debt. There were bad investments. My father refinanced more than once. And you were going to let me marry into that without telling me." "It is not my debt. This agreement specifically protects me from learning whose debt it is." He stood and began pacing. "I hate this. I hate all of it, but if you sign, she will calm down. We will get married, live our life, and none of these clauses will ever matter." There are sentences that end a relationship before either person admits the relationship has ended. That was ours. I said, "You are asking me to risk the jobs of 76 people so your mother can feel calm." His face changed. 76. Yes. I thought you had maybe 15. You never asked. You never told me. I told you I owned a regional restoration company. You said local. We work in 4 counties. He sat again, stunned, but the surprise was not the part that hurt most. The part that hurt was that even after understanding the scale, he did not tear up the agreement. He said, "Then we can revise the business clause." "No, we can reject the document." "That will cause a war." "A war is already happening. You keep asking me to surrender quietly enough that you do not have to call it one." He looked at me with wounded disbelief. "I have spent my whole life trying to keep peace in that family." "Peace for whom?" He had no answer. I placed the agreement back in the envelope and slid it toward him. "Tell your mother I will review it." He exhaled with relief, thinking review meant surrender delayed. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table until the room went dark around me. The brass key rested against my chest. I thought about every door I had entered by making myself smaller, every friendship in which I hid success to avoid envy, every relationship in which I softened competence so a man would not call it dominance, every dinner at Pembroke House where I had treated disrespect as a customs fee for belonging. Ruth had never taught me to beg at doors. She had taught me to understand lock. Keys. That night, I took the charcoal gray folder from the office safe. The next morning, I called Naomi. "I need the agreement finalized," I said. "For negotiation. For disclosure." She heard something in my voice. "What happened?" "They sent their version." I emailed it. "This is coercive, one-sided, and almost certainly vulnerable to challenge. The timing is improper. There is no reciprocal disclosure. The confidentiality provisions appear designed to conceal existing liabilities. Do not sign it. Do not initial it. Do not write on it." The rehearsal dinner was not simply a meal. It was leverage arranged in round tables. She believed I would fear appearing greedy more than I feared losing what I had built. For most of my life, she would have been right. The evening before the dinner, I sat alone in the loading bay of our main warehouse after the crews had gone home. Rows of drying equipment stood silent beneath fluorescent lights. The first broken wet vacuum I had ever owned sat on a shelf above my old workbench. I kept it there as a reminder that every machine eventually failed, and every business began with something inadequate. I loved the man who saved soaked sheet music because children would care. I loved the man who played piano badly after dinner and made my employees laugh at the company picnic. I loved the teacher who remembered every student's favorite song. But love is not only tenderness in safe rooms. Love is also what a person does when tenderness becomes expensive. Adrian had loved me privately and abandoned me publicly in small installments. I could not marry him the next day unless something fundamental changed. For the first time, I accepted that the change might not come. I put the key back around my neck, placed both documents in the gray folder, and made one promise to myself. I would not leave the rehearsal dinner having signed away my name, my work, or my voice. Whether I left with Adrian was his decision. Whether I left with myself was mine. The Armitage Club looked magnificent from the driveway. Up close, I saw what the lighting concealed: patched stone, tarnished brass, and a front step repaired with material that did not quite match. Inside, tall arrangements of white roses filled the ballroom, but only the flowers nearest the head table were real. The others were silk. Evelyn moved among the guests like a woman conducting an orchestra no one else could hear. Camille wore emerald satin and greeted me with the bright attention of someone waiting for a trap to close. Thomas stood near the windows with one hand in his pocket. When I entered, his eyes settled on the gray folder beneath my arm. He knew. Not what was inside, perhaps, but enough to understand I had not arrived unprepared. Adrian met me near the head table. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "Please, let us get through tonight." I looked at him. That depends on what tonight asks me to surrender. His face tightened, but before he could answer, Evelyn called us to our seats. Dinner began with speeches about continuity. An uncle described the Pembroke name as a bridge between generations. Camille told a story about Adrian as a child protecting a wounded bird. Everyone laughed in the expected places. I sat beneath the chandelier with Ruth's key warm against my skin and felt strangely calm. Between the main course and dessert, Evelyn rose. She thanked the guests for witnessing the joining of two lives and one historic family. Then she spoke about trust. She spoke about duty. She spoke about how families survived because responsible people protected what previous generations had sacrificed to preserve. Finally, she lifted the cream folder from the chair beside her. "There is one small matter remaining," she said. The room quieted. She walked to me rather than asking me to come to her. That choice was deliberate. She wanted to stand while I sat. She placed the agreement in front of me and uncapped a black fountain pen. "Mara, we have tried to welcome you despite the differences in our backgrounds. Before you enter this family tomorrow, we require your assurance that your intentions are honorable." Adrian said, "Mother, this is not necessary here." But he said it softly. Evelyn continued as though he had not spoken. You have no inherited position, no family assets, and no understanding of the responsibilities attached to our name. Signing this will demonstrate that you are not seeking advantage." The ballroom became so quiet, I could hear ice shift inside a glass. I looked around at the faces turned toward me. Some were curious, some embarrassed. A few looked pleased to have their private assumptions confirmed. Then Evelyn said, "Surely a woman bringing nothing of consequence into a marriage has nothing to fear from protecting what belongs to others." She offered me the pen. I took it. Camille's shoulders relaxed. Evelyn's mouth softened with victory. Adrian closed his eyes for H. Alpha second. I opened the agreement and turned to the clause Naomi had marked. Instead of signing, I drew a slow circle around the paragraph, claiming rights to any business enhanced by the Pembroke name. Then I stood. "Since this is a family matter being handled in front of witnesses," I said, "the witnesses should understand what they are being asked to approve." Evelyn's smile faltered. I read the clause aloud. I read the confidentiality penalty. I read the waiver of independent advice. I read the section requiring my future work to be treated as a benefit of Pembroke's social standing. A murmur moved through the room. Evelyn reached for the paper. "That language is standard." I held it out of reach. Standard agreements include disclosure from both parties. This is not a negotiation. That is the first honest thing you have said tonight. Adrian stood beside me. "Mara, please." I turned to him. "Please what? Sign. Sit down. Protect your mother from the sound of her own document." His face went pale. I placed the fountain pen across the cream folder and opened my gray one. "I was told I bring nothing of consequence," I said, "so let us define nothing." I removed the summary page of my financial disclosure. I did not read every account number. I did not expose private details that belonged to my employees or clients. I read only what was necessary. I stated that Ellison Recovery Group operated 32 service vehicles and employed 76 people. I named our municipal, hospital, and school contracts. I stated the company's independently assessed value, the properties owned without mortgage, and the investment reserves maintained for disaster response. The room's arithmetic changed in real time. People who had looked at my pickup and seen failure now understood they had been looking at choice. People who had heard restoration and imagined a cleaning crew now saw an enterprise large enough to purchase the club's debt and still meet payroll. Thomas pushed back his chair so abruptly it scraped the floor. He half rose, staring at the valuation page. Evelyn turned toward him. "Thomas." He sank back down slowly, one hand covering his mouth. He knew what the others did not. The total value of everything the Pembrokes still controlled was less than the number printed beside my company's name. I looked at Evelyn. "You said I came for what belongs to your family. Your agreement attempts to claim a business founded before I met Adrian, built without your introductions, and expanded without your name. It also requires me to keep silent about liabilities you have not disclosed." Her expression changed from shock to fury. "How dare you discuss our finances?" "I have not discussed them. You did, when you asked me to sign a confidentiality clause about them without telling me what they were. Camille stood. You went through private papers. I opened the wrong door. The debts were not hidden well enough to support the performance. A few guests looked down at their plates. Evelyn's composure cracked. You think money makes you equal to us. No, I said. That is the difference between us. I do not think money decides equality. The words seemed to strike her harder than the valuation. I placed my own agreement on the table. This document protects what Adrian and I each built before marriage. It shares what we build together. It requires full disclosure, separate lawyers, and time to decide. I was prepared to sign it because partnership deserves honesty. I turned to Adrian. But there will be no wedding tomorrow. He stared at me. Mara, I will not marry a man who asks me to surrender so he can avoid conflict. I love you. That is true. It is also not enough. The room disappeared from my attention. There was only Adrian, the gentle man from the flooded music room, and the frightened son who had spent his life confusing silence with safety. I am leaving tonight, I told him. Do not follow me because you are embarrassed. Do not choose me because the numbers surprised you. Decide whether you can stand beside the full truth of me when your family dislikes the shape of it. If you can, you will know what to do. If you cannot, then we should end here. I removed the sapphire ring and placed it beside the fountain pen. Evelyn whispered, You will regret humiliating this family. I looked at her shaking hands. No, I regret how long I helped you humiliate me. Then I picked up the gray folder and walked out. No one stopped me. In the parking lot, cold air hit my face, and for several seconds I could not breathe. I had imagined leaving with power. Instead, I felt grief so large it bent me against the side of my old pickup. I had lost the wedding, the future I had pictured, and perhaps the man I loved. But beneath the grief was something steady. I still had my name. I still had the key. I still had the woman Ruth had raised. Adrian did not come to my house, Th. At night, he did not call the next morning. By afternoon, the florist, caterer, and photographer had all been informed that the wedding was canceled. For 11 days, I heard nothing. On the 12th morning, Adrian arrived at the warehouse before sunrise. He wore the same wool coat he had worn the day we met. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring the ring. He brought a cardboard box. Inside were copies of his financial records, a letter confirming he had hired his own attorney, and documents showing he had removed himself from every Pembroke family trust and resigned from the board of the foundation that existed mostly on stationery. I moved out of the apartment they paid the deposit on, he said. I changed my emergency contact. I told my mother I will not see her until she can speak about you without contempt. I said nothing. He looked exhausted. I am not asking you to marry me. I am asking for the chance to become someone who could deserve an answer someday. That sounds rehearsed. It was. I have spent 11 days discovering I do not know how to speak without first imagining her reaction. That honesty reached me more than any apology. He continued, You were right. I loved you privately because private love cost me nothing. The moment loving you required conflict, I asked you to pay the price for me. I am ashamed of that. I wanted to forgive him immediately. Wanting is not the same as readiness. We are not getting married, I said. I know. We are not pretending the dinner fixed anything. I know. You do not get credit for leaving a system after it finally injured you. I know. He nodded toward the warehouse. May I help with something? I handed him a broom. For 6 months, that was how we began again. He went to therapy. He kept distance from Evelyn. He learned to disagree without collapsing into apology or defensiveness. He met my employees as people, not as proof of my success. He asked questions about the company and listened to the answers. When one of his relatives called me vulgar for discussing money publicly, Adrian ended the conversation before I heard about it. Most importantly, he stopped asking me to make difficult things easier for him. We married the following spring in the courtyard, behind my warehouse. There were folding chairs, food from a local restaurant, music played by Adrian's students, and wildflowers arranged in cleaned glass jars from Ruth's old workshop. My crews stood in the front row. Naomi served as one witness. Thomas Pembroke came alone and sat near the back. Before the ceremony, he asked to speak with me. I should have stopped her years ago, he said. I kept telling myself silence was gentleness. It was cowardice. He handed me a small wooden box. Inside was the missing brass plate from the Pembroke reading room, removed during renovations decades earlier. On the back, someone had scratched a sentence. A name survives only through the character of those carrying it. I thought it belonged to Adrian, Thomas said. He told me it belongs with you. I closed the box. I already have a name. Thomas nodded. That is why you understand what one should mean. Evelyn did not attend. Camille sent no message. Adrian did not ask me to reconsider inviting them. We signed a fair premarital agreement 1 month before the ceremony, after full disclosure and separate counsel. No one surrendered a business, a future, or a voice. Pembroke House was sold later that year. The auction notices became public, and the town did what towns always do, expressed surprise at facts many people had quietly suspected. I never spoke to reporters. I never shared the debt figures. Their collapse did not need my assistance. Thomas moved into a small apartment near Adrian's school. Evelyn rented a condominium in another city and told relatives I had destroyed the family. Perhaps she needed that story. I no longer needed to correct it. Ellison Recovery Group expanded into 2 neighboring regions. I replaced the old pickup only after the transmission failed for the 3rd time, and even then I kept it parked behind the warehouse. The brass key now hangs in a shadow box in my office. Beneath it is a small plaque with Ruth's words, "Broken is not the same as worthless." For years, I believed hiding my success protected me from being used. In reality, hiding had also taught the people around me that they were entitled to a smaller version of me. The Pembrokes did not create that wound. They simply found it and pressed until I finally understood where it was. A seat at someone else's table is not belonging if the price is your silence. A family name is not character. Wealth is not worth. And love that survives only when you surrender is not peace. It is possession with softer language. That night at the Armitage Club, Evelyn thought the fountain pen would reduce me to a signature. Instead, it showed me the line I would never cross again. So if someone... E has convinced you that you must become quieter, poorer, less capable, or less visible to be loved. Look carefully at what you are being asked to sign away. Count what you have built, including the parts no bank can value. Say your own name without apology. Then step away from any table that calls your dignity an admission fee. Share this story with someone who needs the courage to stop shrinking. Tell me in the comments what line you finally refuse to cross. Subscribe to After Silence Stories, and I'll meet you in the next episode.